All right, we're going to start off with Persia tonight. Persian Empire has a very long history and very impactful history on places like Egypt and Mesopotamia and Babylon, places we already talked about. So we'll give kind of some background about where the Persian Empire starts and how it grows real quickly, and eventually becomes kind of the superpower of the ancient world for several hundred years, especially after Cyrus the Great here in the 550s. The Persian Empire will be the most powerful, at least in this part of the world, for quite a long time. So we'll talk about different facets of it, and then some of its religious ideas. It's one of its main religions eventually, or one of its long-term most impactful religions. All right. Here's a map of the general, what we today call kind of Middle East and Western Asia. So we've already talked about the two rivers, Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, the Akkadian Empire, and then the Babylonian Empire took over from that. There's also another civilization that pops up a little further to the east along this mountain range, the Zagros Mountains. And a lot of ancient texts generally refer to it as Elam, this word here. They're a different group, a different civilization from the Mesopotamians, and they are seen as foreigners. The Mesopotamians and the Babylonians see them as foreigners. Eventually their civilization grows to the point where they start populating even larger cities further south, and this will eventually become kind of the long-term Persian homeland. So that's a general kind of geography of where this place is. The Persian Empire will have one hugely important king. His name is Cyrus. There will be Cyrus. He's not born yet as we're telling this story. What becomes the Persian Empire was actually broken into two different halves. So there's a northern half and a southern half. And there are two different kings that some texts say these two guys are related to each other, but one is king of the north, Astyages, and one is king of the south, and that's Achaemenes. And they're both powerful kings. They're kind of rivals. They argue with each other. Sometimes they fight each other for land, which is pretty common in the ancient world and pretty common even today. There is a legend about the rise of this king that will unify both halves. His name's Cyrus. That before he was born, Astyages had a dream and felt this was a kind of prophecy from the gods that this child would be born who will end up being Astyages' grandchild. That this child, when he grows up and becomes an adult, will overthrow Astyages, take over the place for himself. So Astyages really doesn't want this to happen because in the ancient world, when you get overthrown, you usually get killed. The new rulers don't really trust you enough to keep you alive. So politics is pretty brutal back then, and you just look to kill any potential rivals in order to yourself avoid being murdered. Does that make sense? Yeah. So Astyages kind of has this prophecy kind of, I wouldn't say guaranteed, but confirmed by some, basically soothsayers and religious types of people. So he really believes in this thing, and he wants to prevent this child from, if not being born, at least growing up. So the child is born, and Astyages gets really worried. So he sends one of his own military men, kind of colonel in his army, on a secret mission to break into the baby's house and stab the baby, kill the baby in the middle of the night, remove the threat to the king. And this guy breaks into the baby's house, and right at the point when he's about to murder the baby in its crib, kind of got a soft heart and didn't want to kill the kid. So he steals the kid out of the house and reportedly gives the kid to some shepherds or something, and they take the kid off to raise him in secret. And the colonel goes back to the king, Astyages, and says, "Mission accomplished, the child is dead." And Astyages says, "Well, thank you, good job, and we're going to have a banquet in your honor," the colonel's honor, which is a big feast. So the colonel shows up to this very kind of honorable and austere dinner with the king and all the king's advisors, and it's a big thing. And the colonel sits down to eat, and all the plates are covered, like all the food is covered to keep it warm. And when the food is revealed, the plate right in front of the colonel is opened up, and it's his own son's head. And that's when Astyages says, "Don't screw with me ever. Don't ever lie to me again." And he killed the guy's own son and served him up his dinner as a warning to anyone else. Yeah, and it's a punishment for lying to him. So Astyages knew that the kid got away. He found out somehow. And that child does eventually grow up. He is sent to the other kingdom, where he grows up and enrolls in the other king's military and becomes known as a very brave fighter and rises to the ranks, and is eventually promoted to the point where he becomes heir to the throne. Yep.
So is that the south, the king of the south? Or which one's north and south?
I think he's in the south, if I remember right. Yep. But Cyrus eventually grows up, becomes the heir to the throne in the south, and when Achaemenes dies, he becomes the king of the south. We don't know if that legend is exactly true. Just like the legend we talked about with Sargon I, it might just be a really good story to tell. So it might just be kind of Cyrus's propaganda. But we do know he becomes king in 559. And most historians believe that he spends about the first 10 years of his rule in the south consolidating power, unifying the south, which basically means eliminating any potential rivals to his power, really making sure the place is under his thumb and in control. And in 550, he launches the invasion of the other half. He attacks the guy who, according to the legend, tried to have him killed at birth. So there's some payback. Oops.
So Astyages is from the north, or is he from the south?
Astyages is the north.
North, okay.
Achaemenes is the south. Yeah, I just have to back this thing up. That doesn't seem to work much. So much for that. So it's basically a kind of Persian civil war. And it's entirely over land. A lot of soldiers really don't want to fight this war because, they're fighting against sometimes their own family members. So on the eve of the big battle that will determine who wins this war, Astyages' own army captures him. His own generals take him prisoner and basically sell him to Cyrus.
Astyages' army?
Yep. So Astyages is kind of overthrown by his own generals because they don't want to fight this war against Cyrus. So Cyrus takes control of the other half. Not non-violently, but through intimidation, basically. And Astyages is captured at a place that we call Pasargad on this map.
Pasargad?
Yeah. And Cyrus will make that the capital city of his new unified empire.
Which one? Pasargad.
Pasargad. This one right here on the little red dot, that's where the city is.
Was that like the capital of the south already?
It was a big city, yeah.
Big city?
Yeah. The last stand, basically. Yeah. And the big problem when you conquer another place is to figure out how to keep control of it. Cyrus's theory was that he didn't want to punish the big landowners of the other kingdom. He didn't want to eradicate them or anything like that, because once you start killing people, they might try to resist. So his kind of peacemaking strategy is to allow the landowners to keep their property, and even the government bureaucrats to keep their positions, their kind of wealth and power. And he just said, you owe allegiance to me now instead of Astyages. And that was very successful. So Cyrus is now in control of a unified empire that is kind of on the rise compared to especially the old Babylonian areas and almost any other group in this whole region. And he starts to expand his empire. He starts attacking further north and west, pretty much along these mountain ranges, up to these lakes, and then going further west into what on this map is called Anatolia, this peninsula way up here. His conquest grows so quickly that, on this map it's better, that he starts getting close to the Lydians, which are way out in western Anatolia. And the Lydians start getting worried that he's going to attack them next. So they actually start a surprise attack against the Persian holdings as they kind of get closer and closer and closer. And that angers Cyrus because he never declared war or anything. So Cyrus takes his armies and actually counterattacks and starts moving into Lydia and conquering all that territory. The last battles happen around the big city called Sardis. So the Persian Empire is growing very, very dramatically up into the west. And as they conquer Anatolia, that creates another series of problems. Greece is right next door. Greece is in these series of islands just to the west. So there's hundreds and hundreds of Greek cities, some of them with big populations and big armies. And as they see the Persian Empire growing right up to their doorstep, the Greeks get very worried and they start kind of mobilizing, getting ready for a gigantic war. Does that make sense? Next, Cyrus goes through and he launches a southern invasion into the old Mesopotamian area. A lot of historians think that he wanted to invade Egypt, but he couldn't do that until he took this kind of in-between land mass. So he launches a gigantic invasion of kind of the old Babylonian areas and conquers them one by one, and this is a long-term thing. This takes many years. And he conquers the whole Mediterranean coastline, the eastern coastline, which today includes places like Jerusalem and Damascus and whatnot, big cities. And when he conquered all these areas, he looks to make political deals basically with anyone that's willing to help run the place for him. So same kind of things he did when he conquered the other half of the Persian Empire. He looks for people that have been running a certain place for a while, and they're willing to honor him and give the tax revenue to his government, and he allows them to keep land just as kind of bureaucrats. So one group he makes a deal with along the Mediterranean coast are the Hebrews, which is a group that has tried to live in one place or another, been moving around for 1,000 years or so by this point, 1,500 years, from Egypt up into way up into the coastline, and just been kicked out of one place after another over many, many hundreds of years. And they were actually kicked out of the place that they were occupying when they built the original Kingdom of Israel. And when Cyrus conquers the people who kicked the Hebrews out, he makes a deal with the Hebrews: I'll give you the land back as long as you follow orders from me. Does that make sense? And we'll get back to that later when we talk about the ancient Hebrews and their history.
He was basically making his own applicable, like say, town, right? Like he was creating his own villages, probably.
The village is already there.
Mm-hmm.
He's just conquering the place and saying, instead of worshiping whoever you had before as king, now I'm king.
Right.
And whoever disagrees with that is going to lose their property and maybe have their family executed.
Kind of like the path of least resistance. All you got to do is take your flag off your buildings and put my flag on it,
Mhm.
and then pay your taxes to me, and you keep doing whatever you want.
Yeah, as long as you don't
Yeah.
get out of line, you basically follow orders from the new leadership. Yeah, this is empire. And empires like to have little puppet governments all over the place that they can control. And they'll let them exist as long as they remain controlled, as long as they stay in line. And you still see this kind of stuff happening all over the world today. All right, moving on. No? Yes? You have no opinion? Oh, okay, yeah.
So he's basically conquering outside, say working south all the way southwest, right? Working his way up to the north.
Southwest from here?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and he's going along the mountain range all the way into the Lydian area up here on this map, and then
And
turns
then he
south.
conquers.
Yeah. So this is a massively, quickly growing empire that started out just in this little area called Parsa on this map, and expands to basically take over, up until the Babylonian conquest, almost all the important areas that we've talked about so far, except for Egypt.
Into the Arabian Peninsula.
No, not into Arabia. This is a gigantic desert that is almost unlivable even today, even with all modern air conditioning and whatnot. So this is uninhabitable in the center of the peninsula in the ancient world. Some people cross back and forth on camels and find little watering holes, but it cannot support big populations. So there's some traders that move back and forth across the desert, but the only big populations in this peninsula are kind of along the edges where you get rainfall and some higher elevations. And, well, not on this map, but there's a southern edge also kind of down here. You get some population there, but not in the middle of the thing. Not until modern times. Modern technology allows for it. Yeah. Other questions? Nope. Moving on from here. Okay. So is threatening the Greeks, has conquered the Babylonians, and Cyrus now feels that he's ready to launch an invasion of Egypt, which is another of these giant centers of wealth in the ancient world. Cyrus first, though, hears that, before he can get that started, Cyrus hears that there is kind of breakout or revolt against him way back in the Persian homeland, these kind of eastern areas along the mountains where he had started. So he first has to take his army further east, back into Persia, to fight off this revolt. And he's actually killed on the battlefield. So Cyrus, he dies on the battlefield in 530. Remember, we're counting backward. We're doing a countdown to year zero in the BCE times, before year zero. So he has a long, legendary career as the leader of the Persian Empire, about 30 years or so. Started off as just the king of one half of Persia and expanded that territory to a massive scale. And by the time he dies, the Persian Empire is like the superpower of this region. It seems unstoppable. No one's defeated him yet, until he dies on the battlefield. So we believe his son, Cambyses, takes over for him in 530. And there's not many images out there of Cambyses. The best image I can find is him already looking kind of old. It appears that immediately his great ambition is to fulfill Cyrus's great dream of conquering Egypt. Yeah.
So Cambyses, when does he assume the throne? You said
530.
530?
Right when Cyrus dies. Yeah. So Cambyses directs the government to attack Egypt and try to conquer the place. to fulfill Cyrus's dream. And the government does that. It takes several years. Egypt is still a pretty powerful place, center of wealth and influence in the ancient world. But the Persian armies invade. They don't win so much because the Persian armies are so much better than the Egyptians, but the many Egyptian cities have been fighting each other in civil wars for a few years. So they don't have like a unified Egyptian army to fight back. The Egyptians don't trust each other, basically. Does that make sense? So they put up a resistance, but the Persians conquer them within a few years.
Is this one of those intermediary periods between like great dynasties, or is this after all that?
This is the third intermediate period, which is after all the most famous history of Egypt that you probably have ever heard of. Egypt is a decentralized government. There is no one central king or pharaoh anymore. There's like 8 different guys in different cities all calling themselves the pharaoh of all Egypt, and they fight each other for it. So they don't trust each other even when a foreign invasion hits. They try to use the foreign invasion to knock each other out. Does that make sense? Yeah, it doesn't help Egyptian defense at all. So Cambyses and his government accomplished Cyrus's giant fantasy of conquering Egypt. And then another revolt breaks out back in the Persian homeland. So Cambyses takes a large chunk of the army that was in Egypt, and they start traveling along the roads back to the Persian homeland. It appears he got sick en route and died before he ever made it back to kind of central Persia. So Cambyses isn't around very long, 7 or 8 years. And this is his big claim to history, conquering Egypt. Does that make sense? All right. So by this point, the Persian Empire is just unbelievably massive. They've conquered every center of wealth that they ever knew of, really. They have destroyed every amount of resistance in their way, and done so with only 30 or 40 years. So it's phenomenal growth. And there's a feeling that the Persians can never be defeated. By this point, they're building armies out of the soldiers from their conquered areas. So they can build the biggest armies that this region has ever seen in its whole history before. They have more tax revenue because they have more land than anyone else. This place is the superpower, and it seems unstoppable. Does that make sense? There's this feeling of invincibility amongst the Persian leaders. And when the Greeks start making noise and complaining and worrying, the Persians don't really worry that much about the Greeks because there's hundreds and hundreds of different Greek cities, and they all fight each other just in this little area. And the Persians just look at the map and say, well, we have all of this. How can they possibly stop us? But again, when Cambyses dies, his son, named Darius, should be a U here. It should be Darius. That's a typo. But Darius is next in line. He becomes the next king on Cambyses' death, and Darius is going to be around for quite a long time, good 45 years or so. And Darius's number one interest is to figure out a way of ruling all these vastly different peoples who speak different languages, use different money, follow different religions, keep them all together within one unified empire, which has been a long-term historical problem for every single empire. How do you convince other peoples to accept being conquered by you? And so I'll talk a little bit about how Darius accomplishes this. So the empire he inherits is multinational, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic. It's a patchwork of different peoples, different civilizations. And he wants to and his advisors, he's not doing this alone, they want to figure out some kind of system to keep control over the thing. And this is probably his government's greatest accomplishment, is that they do keep control over it for so long. And there's many, many pictures of Darius because he's such a famous king. So we'll go through just a few of his strategies. The first one we've already kind of toyed with a little bit. Number one, he took this gigantic empire and divided it up into different provinces. Province, usually in the world, is kind of like a state in the United States. It's one kind of region or one area of the overall whole. So like California would be a province of the United States. Does that make sense? No? Yeah.
Yes.
So the United States would have like 50 different provinces, localities, that often have their own administrations, their own local governments to run things on a smaller scale, like local court systems or agricultural investments or local tax systems or whatever. And I can't remember if we talked about this before, but just the word state, most of the world looks at a state as a unified government, like France is a state, or Britain is a state, or Iraq is a state. The United States, we have a different kind of interpretation of that because we have 50 states that come together to make a bigger state. Does that make sense? Because when the United States first gained independence, there were 13 different states, literally like 13 different little countries. They all had their own money and whatnot.
Okay, so then when they say countries, it would be just different provinces, or?
When the United States became an independent country, it was like 13 different countries. They had their own laws, they had their own money, they had their own governors, they had their own militaries. And it took a few years, but they decided to get together into like one super state, the federal government. They linked each other.
That's how France is too, right?
Well, France has been one unified country for a long, long, long time, so they just have provinces and cities. So France is a state. But much like the United States, the United States centralized government doesn't want to have to run, farming in the San Joaquin Valley. They want to leave that to someone else. So they divide up the territory in these different realms, in different localities. And in the Persian Empire, there's 20 of them. And like Egypt is its own province, Assyria is its own province, Anatolia is split into a few different provinces. And then there's the central province, the central administration in Persia itself. The problem, though, when you split this thing up and you give authority to different groups all over the place is that they may not be very trustworthy. They may say that they're going to follow orders and turn over the tax revenue to the central government, but they may steal some of that money. They may embezzle. They may never report that money in the first place. You get what I mean? The local administrators might be underhanded and greedy. And if they think they can get away with it, they'll steal. So Darius not only split them into provinces and gave them all kind of localized governments, but purposely sent spies and auditors into those local governments to report to him directly, personally, on a consistent basis, to watch out for embezzlement, thievery, lying, that kind of stuff. And the one thing that Darius seemed most afraid of is that, say, if the Egyptian leaders are running the province kind of way out far away, that they can make promises, but they might be able to build up enough wealth and build a big enough army to eventually start a revolution and break away and be independent again. Does that make sense? So it's not just worrying that the governor and his family are just stealing money to make themselves rich, but they're going to use that money to pay soldiers to fight a revolutionary war and break away. So within, say, the Egyptian provincial government, the head tax collectors the head bridge builders, the generals of the local little militia. They're all government bureaucrats. They work for the Persian state. And if you're one of those employees, you never know if other people in your office are the king's spies. You never know who the spy is. Does that make sense? It could be the person working at the desk right next to you. And that keeps the bureaucrats honest, or should, because they know if they get caught doing something, then they'll be punished. Is that clear? So it's a kind of corporate espionage on the governmental level. So this would be like, I don't know, the head of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power has their big building in LA where they plan out bridges and rail lines and all kinds of things and electricity grid. But if the U.S. government doesn't trust them, they'll send U.S. spies from the CIA to be in that building and pretend to be workers within the building. And they're actually spying on the employees to see who's stealing and who's making plots. Does that make sense?
Do we need to know all 20?
Say again?
provinces? Do we have to know all 20? for
Oh, no.
this?
Just know there's about 20. But this is a super secret group, and they report to the king directly, right to Darius himself. And they become known as the king's eyes and ears. They collect information on their own government, report back to the king, and the king makes decisions about what to do. Does that make sense?
So it's like a boogeyman. Like everybody knows that they're out there,
But you never know who it
but
is.
he makes it so that nobody knows who it is.
Yeah. So it could be any of your coworkers. If you have a lot of family members in the government, it could be family members. So you watch what you say around people. You have to really trust someone. If you have a plan to steal money and you need someone's help, you have to really deeply trust that person because they might be the king's spy. So there's a lot of intrigue and underground stuff going on. A lot of secrets. But it's very effective for keeping people honest because a lot of people aren't willing to take the risk of stealing if they think there's a good possibility they'll be caught and punished. And in order to kind of facilitate this, Darius and his advisors have a massive series of roads built all over the empire to connect not just the provinces, but most of the major cities within the provinces. The most famous road was said to have gone from Susa up to Babylon and all the way out to Sardis, out to the corner of the empire, so that messages could be sent from way out in the corner of the empire right back down to the capital city. So Susa is like the Washington, D.C. of the Persian Empire. It's their administrative center. This is where the king mostly lives and all his advisors. So that's where the government is run
Is that still
from.
Passagardia or whatever?
Passagar, it's not on this map, but it's about here. That is becomes more of a ceremonial center. That's where new kings are crowned.
Wow.
But Darius kind of moves the administration, the guys running the place, to Susa. And these roads, they're planned out in great degree. And there is a messenger service specifically for only government messages because they don't have cell phones back then. They can't just call each other up or send an email or something. So they have to figure out the fastest way to get messages in an emergency from, say, Egypt to Susa so decisions could be made, and then a message back to implement decisions. And they planned on having a stopping point every 18 miles along every single road to Susa and back. And why 18 miles?
So like a day's travel?
Yeah, at the fastest speed you can go, which is a horse running at full speed. So you can run a horse 17 or 18 miles as fast as it can go, and you can get to the next resting point and you have the message in a packet or something. You give the packet to the next rider on a fresh horse, and they take it the next 18 miles. And reportedly, they could get a message from way out here in Sardis all the way down to Susa in just 2 or 3 days. So it was the fastest travel possible for this part of the world at this time. So you can see the government is obsessed with the movement of information. And they realize that's one of the centers of their power, one of their ways of keeping this whole thing together. Other questions? Nope. Good. All right. Other things that Darius does, he and his advisors create this tax system where they tax the provinces 20% straight across the board of all the crops that they're growing. So if you own a farm somewhere out in Anatolia or Egypt or wherever else, 1 out of every 5 pieces of food that you grow becomes payable in taxes to the government. So it's kind of flat tax. But they get some benefit from it. They get all these roads, they get communication networks, they get all kinds of things, and the protection of the Persian army in case anything happens. And there's only one group that does not pay the 20%. And who do you think that is?
Kings.
Well, the king and his royal family, they don't pay taxes. They're government employees, technically.
Persians.
The Persians themselves.
Yeah.
The Persian people don't pay the 20%. So the Persian people in the center of the empire, the Persian homeland, they love this system because a whole lot of them are living tax-free. So all this wealth and power that Persia is building up is really kind of taken from the places they've conquered, and which is pretty common for empires. Keep your own people on your side by giving them something and not charging them much, and you charge other people, the people you're oppressing, to keep the wealth flowing. Persia also, they use Aramaic as their language, and they expand Aramaic across their whole empire. So it becomes a codified writing system for the whole empire. In a lot of ways, the same as English is today throughout much of the world. A lot of people grow up in other places not speaking English natively in their own families, in their own towns. But when they go to school, if they want to become part of the educated class and get jobs in government or in big business or something, back then they have to speak Aramaic as the Central Persian written language. So Aramaic expands out into all of the provinces and becomes their kind of universal language of government and business and anything involving large sums of money usually. And it's an advantage to some cultures because some, like the Sumerians, had, like, you remember that gigantic language we talked about a while ago where they had hundreds and hundreds of different letters and characters.
Cuneiform.
Yeah, the cuneiform language was extremely complex and difficult to learn, whereas Aramaic only has, I think, 22 different letters, so it's much easier to learn and use. And there's also a gigantic law code that the Persian government kind of propagates and forces onto its empire, which, when you read the details of it and compare it to laws of other places, like even some of the places they conquered, the Persian law code is really very fair. And it was applied, at least theoretically, to all people equally, no matter how rich or how poor you were. No matter if you are a poor peasant out there in the farms, or the king himself. The king had to follow the law. The king could not change the law by himself. So he is not one of these absolutist tyrant. He's tyrannical in a lot of ways, but he cannot break the law. And that's part of his oath of office, basically, when he's crowned king, emperor. And they build basically courthouses all over the empire. And it seems to be a very efficient and very useful system. So there's a certain amount of what we today call some kind of social justice in the old Persian Empire, at least better than other ancient areas that are just run according to whatever the king says, and there is no law except for the king's desire. Does that make sense? So politics and court systems are really extraordinarily brutal in the ancient world. If you just say anything bad about the king, you could be tortured to death. The one thing that the Persian law code wouldn't put up with is questioning the king's authority. So you could be executed for that. But a lot of other, common theft and whatnot was not brutally, unbelievably punished. You wouldn't be executed for stealing a cow or something. And Darius also demanded that the Persian Empire tolerate the many religions of the areas it conquered. Did not want to go through and eradicate any non-Persian religious ideas. So there is not a religious obsession from the government to destroy any branch religious movements or anyone who refused to convert to Persian religious ideas or the Persian gods, which is also pretty special for the ancient world. Usually when you get a conquest, a king will demand that all the new people that have been conquered convert to the king's religion. If they don't, they'll often be slaughtered. So it's pretty tolerant compared to what else is going on in the world at the time, really across the globe even.
Did they have a state religion?
Yeah, I can't remember really the details of it. But yeah, there was an official religion that the king and his family followed, and that most Persians followed. And it's usually one of these polytheistic religions of many gods instead of belief in one God, which is what has become normal in the world today. Belief in the one creator God as judge of all people and all that kind of stuff. You've heard of this before?
Monotheism.
Yeah, monotheism, belief in one God. So that's Islam, Christianity, a whole bunch of others, Judaism. All right, and the last major method that they use is to dedicate, especially the most important homeland cities, as different special cities for the empire. Like Susa is the administrative capital. That's where the advisors sit. That's where the big decisions are made. Pasargad is the ceremonial center, especially for religious rituals and crowning kings and like big important society-wide types of events and celebrations. And that's because Pasargad is where Cyrus united the two empires by having Astyages captured. So that was seen as like the beginning, the core of the Persian Empire as it started to grow. And another city on this map is called Persepolis. In the ancient times, is often called Parsa. Is the treasury. That's where the imperial money is kept. It's where the government's gold is, and a lot of the auditors, the bankers.
Is it Persepolis?
Persepolis.
Persepolis.
And there's other things that happen in these cities too. Just like with any capital city of any government, you get a lot of workers moving in because there's buildings that have to be built, so architects move in because there's work there. That's where jobs are. And you see that all over the world even today. And big important government officials like to have their clothes cleaned, and they like to have the nicest clothes. So tailors and dry cleaners and all these other kinds of people move into the capital city because that's where the money's being spent. Government leaders like to have big parties with nice wine and special food, so that's where all the cooks move. Does it make sense? No. Oh, ready? All right, now getting into some religious ideas. Going back about 1,000 years in history, 1,000 years before Cyrus is ever around, you have a mass movement of Eastern European people, so way even north of Greece on this map, way up into Europe. For some reason, historians don't know exactly why, but starting around the year 1500 CE, or BCE, before zero, there is suddenly a mass movement of people in Europe. They start moving around for some reason. We don't exactly know why. Maybe a giant earthquake, or plague, or who knows. But they start moving around a lot. And they'll move around for 1,000 years. So a lot of them start moving south into Greece. And some of them stay in Greece. Not all of them. A lot of the rest keep moving. Some move further down into Egypt on boats. Some move down into Anatolia and they stay there. More people keep moving. And this mass wave of people just continues spreading and spreading and spreading until it gets all the way down, actually into India, what is today India. But they don't all go to India. I mean, some different people like different areas, and they just kind of settle where they want. Does that make sense? So the textbooks will call these Aryans because they were different looking people than the people that they were running into in what we today call the Middle East and India. And they move into the Persian Empire, especially the Persian homeland, in such large numbers, and they take up residence there, that they become one of the kind of dominant societies within the Persian Empire, one of the largest populations. And they're moving in right around the time where Cyrus is alive, into the 500s. Does that make sense? And they move in such numbers that the modern country of Iran is actually named after them. But they come in with different religious ideas than the local native people in Persia. It appears that the Persians were polytheist and so were the Aryans. And as the Aryans move in, they start to settle. You start getting intermarriages and people talking with each other and sharing ceremonies. So their religious ideas kind of get merged together. They get melded together, just with human contact. And you get an interesting religious movement that is a kind of combination of the two different cultures emerging in Persia right around, again, Cyrus's time, which we've been talking about. So it is polytheistic, and polytheistic means they believe in many gods, more than one god. And they generally tend to divide their population of gods into two different realms. One are the gods of nature. The god, you have a god that runs the hurricanes, a god that runs the rainfall, a god that runs the crops growing in the harvest, a god of the moon, a god of the sun, all that kind of stuff. And you have another set of gods that run human decision-making, kind of morality. The god of good behavior, the god of drunkenness, the god of lust, all these kinds of things. So people, when they feel they need help with the crops growing, they'll give a dedication to the god of the harvest to try to get help, to try to get that god favorable to them. They give them gifts. Does that make sense? And if you want to have a big party, you give a dedication or a sacrifice to the god of wine or something to help you with your party. There's also a sacred kind of liquor called homa that is, today scientists have broken it down. It's still around. It's still used in religious ceremonies. Broken it down chemically to try to figure out what makes it so powerful. And its kind of central core is similar to what we today use to make the drug ephedra. So which is a painkiller, a very powerful painkiller. So it is something that's very intoxicating. Does that make sense? And they use it in the religious ceremonies because they feel if they drink it, then they kind of transition from the human world into the realm of the gods. Does that make sense?
Being high?
Yeah, it's getting them really high. And they feel that they are, leaving the physical world behind and having like these religious experiences. So it becomes a central part of their religious ceremonies. And another part of their ceremony is, especially cooking, they often see different animals as physical representations of different gods. So they will sacrifice animals and even barbecue them and eat them as symbolic of, asking for a god's favor or doing damage to a harmful god. Does that make sense? No? Yes. Okay. So they see fire as a purifying kind of force. It's a big part of their ceremonies. So a lot of these happen at night, and they turn into maybe what you would think of as like big social barbecues with dancing and ceremony and whatnot. Yep.
Why do they sacrifice the bull?
Well, that goes back to one of their creation stories with the god Mithra. This story about the god of fire is that before humans or any plant life is around in the world is like just chaos, just things happening all over the place. It's the time of the gods where there isn't much life around in the world. There aren't even that many animals. And the story says that Mithra is hanging out in this primordial era of the gods and gets angry when one of the kind of gods of disruption in this bull is just running all over the place, damaging the world, just breaking things. So Mithra catches the bull and throws the bull in a cave and kind of puts a big rock against the cave to keep the bull inside, to reduce the chaos. But the bull breaks out somehow and starts breaking stuff again, running all over the place. So Mithra's decision is that the only way to end the chaos is to kill the bull. And that's what this is a carving of. It's Mithra cutting the bull's throat to kill him, to end the chaos. And here's a drawing version of it so you can see it a little more clearly.
Snake there too.
Yeah.
And dogs.
Yeah. But the legend says that when Mithra cut the bull's throat, the bull bled all over the place, and the exact spots on the ground where the blood hit the ground, crops start growing. And vegetation starts happening and growing out from there, and this is what people depend on for food. Right? So this allows humans to come about after the gods have left. So Mithra is one of their giant important gods, and the story of slaughtering the bull is something that they replicate over and over again within their own religious ceremonies.
And that's what Vikings came up with too, right? Like that's where they kept.
I don't know anything about the Vikings. I haven't watched the TV show. Or I've watched it a couple times, and my joke is that it's always, who are we going to conquer and slaughter next? Let's go over there. Okay. But I have a lot of friends who really like that show, so that's my joke with them. Walk into the room and they're watching it. Oh yeah, who are they slaughtering now? Oh, it's more no, it's not. They're slaughtering somebody. It always ends in a giant battle, right?
Sure does.
Yeah. Because we Americans love violence. But no, I don't know about the Viking religion or anything like that.
Animal sacrifice is really common amongst most ancient polytheistic religions.
Yep.
Bulls especially.
Yep. And I would argue even today. When's the last time you got to a barbecue and they were cooking corn or something? Like no meat. Has that ever happened to you? Or they're cooking tofu?
Unless they're vegetarian.
Yeah. And vegetarians don't tend to usually have those big barbecues, right? So I argue that we still have this. I mean, we're not out there killing a bull and cutting it up in our own backyard, right? Unless you guys are actually doing that.
Mexican or Central American.
Well, it's
Just
all
kidding.
kinds of people. But I think it's still going on. It's just much more sanitized. We just go to the grocery store and get our big package of meat and try not to think of where it comes from, I guess. I don't know.
But it's not usually religiously motivated.
To me, the ceremonies look the same. There's a lot of dancing and drinking, and so yeah, I'm always entertained by it. But maybe I'm the only one who thinks these things.
Okay.
No.
Is that also where the bullfighting came? Not bullfighting, but like the.
I don't know if it comes directly out of this, or if that's another ceremony that got going with another culture. I just don't know. There's a lot of ceremonies out there, and I don't follow many of them. But I do know on every holiday, all my friends call me up. Oh, we're going to have this barbecue. Okay.
Viking style.
Mhm.
Just kidding.
I hope not. I don't want to be attacked. But we'll see what happens. Then in the 600s, this guy comes along. We don't know the exact details of his birth or what family he's from or anything, but he is eventually named or called Zarathustra. We don't know really the details of his background. We believe he's born somewhere around 628. We first start hearing of him when he's about in his 20s, late 20s. Some stories say that he was actually a priest in the normal kind of Persian polytheistic religion of his time. But one way or the other, he starts preaching a new religious idea. And he basically says that he wants to make changes to the Persian religion, that he's been given a revelation from just one God that claims to be the one creator God. So he starts talking about monotheism. He says there is one God that created everything, that judges all human souls for morality or wrongdoing or whatever, and is the center of all kind of light and enlightenment and morality and controls all the hurricanes and everything. It's just one God doing it all, which is a really controversial thing to say in Persia of this time. And almost the entire ancient world of the time believes in polytheism, many gods. There's only been a couple instances of monotheists being around so far up to the Persian Empire's time, up to Zarathustra's time.
I think only like the Hebrews.
Yeah, the Hebrews have been around for well over 1,000 years by now, and there's a couple of Egyptian pharaohs that believed in one God, or one really important God over all the rest, but hadn't spread that far out into Persia yet. So he starts preaching this stuff publicly, starts going to the public centers and talking to big crowds about it, trying to convert people to his new movement. And he is so controversial that city leaders hound him and they kind of kick him out of one town after another. So he's feeling persecuted. And some people start threatening his life and saying, if you don't shut up about this, we're going to kill you. He eventually converts one prince of one of the kind of far-flung provinces of the empire, converts one important guy who has a lot of land, and he goes and lives with that guy in his little town. So this prince protects Zarathustra from being attacked, from being murdered. So Zarathustra is allowed, under this protection, to continue developing his ideas and writing things down and laying out what he believes. The center of his belief is in one God. And Zarathustra has said that this God's name is Ahura Mazda. Ahura is basically the word for Lord. So the old Persian religion had many Ahuras, had many lords, kind of higher level gods. And this is Zarathustra saying, get rid of that system of many, there is just one, there is this guy. And he is the creator of the whole universe, judge of all people, directs us all on a moral path, controls all the natural phenomena, all the lightning and hurricanes and floods and everything in the natural world. And sometimes intervenes in the world to keep humans along a correct path. And Zarathustra says that this one God is so powerful and so great that us as humans can't really even understand this Ahura Mazda's language, and that to try to hear Ahura Mazda's voice would like destroy your brain because he's so much greater than any individual human. So Ahura Mazda sends out kind of representatives, lower level, what Zarathustra called immortals, especially 7 of them, that bring Ahura Mazda's message to individual humans. So like messengers. Does that make sense? And this is the deity that Zarathustra tries to convince as many people as he can to give their allegiance to. Which is, again, very controversial in this society. There's also a flip side. There are very few images of the kind of darker side of this religion, because within Zarathustra's religion, simply drawing this god's image, Ahriman's image, is almost to kind of welcome him into your life, or to ask for his presence. And Ahriman is the source of evil and deception and trickery in the world. Ahriman tries to gain individual people's trust and lead them into the path of corruption and kind of what you would call sin, I guess. And the story goes that Ahriman used to be one of Ahura Mazda's immortals and grew corrupted and wanted his own power, and so Ahriman kicked him out. And Ahriman has brought some kind of lower level deities with him. So the Ahriman has his servants he also sends out to try to corrupt individual people. Sound familiar? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of these ideas are circulating all over the region at this time, and often get recycled from one religion to another. They get these stories, these ideas get used again and again amongst many different religions. And Zarathustra predicted that at some point in the world's history, there would be this final war between Ahura Mazda and Ahriman. There would be this final war between good and evil, the moral and the corrupted. And it would be a very close contest that would take many years to fight. But eventually the forces of good would prevail. And at that point, Ahura Mazda will judge all human souls for admission into the kind of heavenly afterlife with Ahura Mazda, or being kind of damned to spend eternity with Ahriman. So again, kind of familiar ideas, right? Zarathustra seems to have realized that these are big, strange new ideas for this part of the world. So in order to convince people to join this new religion, this new movement, many scholars argue that Zarathustra started using kind of normal Persian religious celebrations. So normal facets of it. So Zarathustra will bring fire into his movement as a kind of purifying force, and will use some of the same kind of sacred liquor and sacred foods and representations in animals and whatnot, because it's really difficult to get people to join a totally new idea. It's much easier to kind of bring them along slowly if there's something they can already connect to, something that's familiar. Does that make sense? Yeah. So some of Zarathustra's message is very different from the normal kind of Persian Aryan religious practices, but some of it is very similar. And that's probably by design. When the Greeks come through and conquer the Persian Empire, they hear about all this stuff a few centuries after Zarathustra is around, and the Greeks mistranslate his name into Zoroaster. So a lot of the world today calls this Zoroastrian or Zoroastrianism, just because the Greeks screwed up translating the guy's name. It should probably be called Zarathustrianism or something like that. But because the Greeks eventually become one of the centers of emerging European civilization, what we call Western civilization, people that grow up in Europe or the West still make that mistake and call him Zoroaster and call his movement Zoroastrianism. But they're still around. They're a shrinking religion today, but they still have religious shrines that some have reportedly been open for many centuries. And because fire is such an important thing in their religion, they often have a lot of candles in their shrines. And many of them say that this fire in some of these places has been lit for a couple thousand years by this point. Because anyone who tries to blow out all the candles and put out the fire, it kind of puts their soul at risk, basically. To blow out all the fire, to make it dark, is to reject Ahura Mazda and invite Ahriman into the area. Does it make sense? And even the keepers of the candles and the flames, they often wear face masks. Well, not this guy in this picture, but they don't want to corrupt Ahura Mazda's flame with their human breath. So it's that revered. Does that make sense? All right. Questions about that at all? Nope. Moving on from here. No opinion. You're alive? All right.
I think Catholic people still practice that, right?
It's slightly different in Catholicism, but yeah, they have a big emphasis on, especially candles on the altar.
It was like Zarathustra got an advanced copy of Revelations.
Yeah. And some scholars argue that some people who eventually write some of the parts of the Bible were earlier in their lives were advisors to the Persian government, so that they've already heard these kinds of stories and they kind of write them down and bring them into the Christian movement eventually. Other scholars argue against that, and there's giant arguments going on about where those stories came from. All right, last section is to quickly talk about what happens to the Persian Empire. We've talked mostly about them in the 500s in Cyrus's lifetime, and then going into Darius. Darius gets to the throne in 522. So Darius is around for a good 20 some odd years, right to the year 500, going into the 400s BCE as we continue the countdown to year 0. The 400s is a tough time for the Persian Empire. The Persians will launch invasions of Greece, which will fail. And that seems to really hurt their military strength. The Persians will retain control of most of their empire for a while, but they lose that image of invincibility. They try to conquer all of Greece and they fail twice. So now there's a feeling that somehow the Persians can be beaten on the battlefield. And especially going into the 300s, the Persian state grows increasingly corrupt, which means they start spending money on ridiculous projects and oftentimes just luxury goods for the royal family and other important politicians. And there's a lot of embezzlement that starts government leaders stealing from the treasury. And the only way the government can eventually deal with that is to raise taxes, get more money because so much is being stolen. So especially into the 300s, they increasingly raise taxes on their provinces, which does a lot of harm to the provincial economies. They're basically overtaxed, and the Persian economy starts going into epidemic troubles. And especially by Darius, I think it's Darius' grandson, has to start fighting to secure his own throne against other members of the royal family. So there's intrigue within the royal family about when the sitting emperor dies, who's going to take over. So there's political factions within the royal family and within the overall government. So you get basically the rise of political parties that try to knock each other out. And as you may notice now in some countries, some of these parties seem more interested in getting control of the place themselves than actually running it well. They're more worried about knocking out their political enemies than actually making good decisions for the long term of the country. Does that make sense? Or the empire. So eventually, by the late 330s, the Greeks will counterattack in a big way and eventually conquer the whole Persian Empire, which is kind of shocking to people at that point, but it happens. So Persia has this kind of astronomical rise in the 500s to the heights of power in this whole region. And then over the next 150 years or so, the 400s and the 300s, they go into a decline phase and are eventually conquered themselves.